At the party, the man sang his heart out. But when people stood up to applaud, he suddenly jumped into the river, struggling like a suffocating fish. Then he crawled towards the train tracks. His colleagues thought he was just drunk and didn't care about his well-being. As the train slowly approached, the man spread his arms and let out a hysterical scream. What kind of life did he go through to end up so desperate, lying on the tracks to commit suicide? The train can't stop, and time can't reverse, but memories can be revisited. As the train slowly moves backward, scenes from the past suddenly reappear. Just 3 days ago, the partner ran away with the investment money. The scheming securities employees turned his money into worthless paper. The blood-sucking loan sharks kept exploiting him. Even his wife left him, taking their child with her. Yong-ho, lost and unsure of his future, locked himself in his car and wandered aimlessly. Then, he received a message, an invitation to a reunion from his beekeeping club, which he hadn't seen in 20 years. But Yong-ho didn't go to the reunion. Instead, he drove all the way to the seaside, took a gun from 2 thugs, and returned to his car. By then, it had started to rain. He put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger without hesitation. Even though he knew the gun was empty, his face still tensed up. At that moment, Yong-ho had a sudden thought. Since his life was already so miserable, he might as well take a few people down with him before he died. So, he followed the stockbroker's car to the garage.
뭐야 이거? 어? 야 김사장. 야 왜 그래? 김사장 왜 그래?
Then Yong-ho went to his ex-wife's house. He wanted to see his daughter one last time before he died, but his ex-wife refused repeatedly. There was even a security chain on the door, as if in her mind, Yong-ho was a violent person. She directly shut him out and coldly closed the door. Yong-ho returned home in the pouring rain, but couldn't find his keys. In his panic, a man suddenly appeared and helped him open the door. This place is more of a storage room than Yong-ho's home, accompanied by the sparse sound of rain. Yong-ho's life is in shambles. He smiles eerily and asks the man if he knows why he ended up like this. It seems like he's also asking himself. At some point, his life became stagnant. Yong-ho screams desperately, his soul lost on this hopeless path. The helplessness ingrained in his bones has nowhere to go. He thought the man was here to collect a debt, so he pointed a gun at himself, ready to end his life. But the man mentioned someone named Yoon Sunim, who wanted to see Yong-ho. Hearing this name, Yong-ho was momentarily stunned. He vaguely remembered a sweet and charming girl who briefly stayed in his memory. Like most people's youth, Sun-rin was Yong-ho's first love. But now, she has become someone else's wife. After much contemplation, Yong-ho finally got into the man's car. To leave a good impression on Sun-rin, he even changed into the clothes the man gave him. After many twists and turns, Yong-ho brought a box of mints to the hospital. Sun-im was already terminally ill and barely conscious, likely not to make it through the night. Yong-ho placed the box of mints in Sun-im's hand and began to reminisce about their first love. They once shared a beautiful romance. That year, he was stationed at the border, and she waited faithfully for him. Every time he wrote to her, she would include a mint in the letter. It was a symbol of their love. Yong-ho couldn't bear to eat them or throw them away, so he secretly kept them. He even endured beatings from his superiors because of it. Now, time has passed. She lost her life on the journey, and he lost his soul. Only the mints still taste the same as they did back then. Sun-im seemed to hear Yong-ho's voice. She also understood the torment and despair in his words. Before Yong-ho left, a tear fell from her eye. The man then handed a camera to Yong-ho, which he had previously left with Sun-im. Now it was being returned to its owner. He went to the rooftop alone and pulled out the film. Those beautiful moments frozen in time also emerged, but each chapter seemed to mock his failed life. Yong-ho collapsed, curling up into a ball. The train wailed through the darkness, carrying his soul back to the summer of 1994. At that time, Yong-ho was a diligent worker. He and his friends started a company and made some money. They thought everything would go smoothly, but on the way to a gathering, Yong-ho suddenly received a phone call. Not knowing what had happened, his face instantly turned grim. Following the instructions from the call, Yong-ho went to the bridge where his wife was practicing driving. Sure enough, he saw an intimate moment between her and the instructor. With a heavy heart, he followed them to a hotel. First, he kicked the man hard, then dragged his wife out of the shower. He beat them both severely. His wife screamed in fear, but Yong-ho didn't stop until he was exhausted. Only then did he let his wife go. Yong-ho returned to the car, seething with anger. He ended up having an intimate moment with his female secretary. As a train passed by, its light illuminated Yonghao's anxious face, reflecting his numbness inside. They finished hastily. During dinner, a boy at the next table accidentally dropped his basketball under Yonghao's table. When the boy tried to retrieve it, Yonghao, like a mad dog, scared him away with a fierce look. When Yongho straightened up, the boy's father also came over. Seeing this, Yongho could only smile awkwardly, feeling extremely embarrassed. Looking at the man in front of him, Yongho felt a sense of familiarity. When they met again in the restroom, he asked meaningfully,
삶은 아름답다. 그렇죠?
A certain sense of despair is revealed between the lines. This forced Yongho to seek answers from others. A few days later, Yongho moved to a new house. To celebrate, he invited his employees over for a meal. However, Yongho was feeling very down and even lost his temper at his dog. The wife always liked to pray at the dinner table, but no matter how much she prayed, her marriage with her husband came to an end. When she opened her eyes again, Yongho had already left. She hurried to chase after him, with their daughter crying incessantly behind her, accompanied by a fit of hysterical sobbing. The train continues to reverse time to 1987. This year, the couple just got married, and the wife is about to give birth. However, Yongho ignores her because, in this year, the June struggle erupted in South Korea. The protests lasted for several days. As a police officer, Yongho naturally had to stop the protests and arrest the demonstrators. That morning, he captured a suspect named Park Myung-sik and brought him back to the police station. Yongho began to torture him to extract information about the whereabouts of other protesters. However, this was not Yongho's true intention. He seemed like a cold machine, dragged into the abyss by so-called rules and regulations. After several rounds of brutal torture, Park Myung-sik confessed and revealed the location of his comrades in Gunsan. But at that moment, Yongho suddenly asked a question.
삶이 아름답다고 생각하니?
Yongho hurried to Gunsan over the next few days. There, he encountered a girl. As the rain lightly fell from the sky, Yongho was reminded of his first love. Sunim's hometown was in Gunsan. Many years ago, they were deeply in love. Yongho wanted to walk the paths she walked, see the sea she saw, feel the same rain, and hear the same inner voice. Usually, Yongho had a gloomy demeanor, but whenever he mentioned Sunim, a smile would unconsciously appear on his lips. The girl was deeply moved by Yongho's affection and offered to spend the night with him. After a brief moment of intimacy, the girl asked for Sunim's name and urged Yongho to speak his heart out, pretending she was Sunim. However, the painful memories made Yongho unable to say anything. He just buried his head in his memories and silently wept. The next morning, as Yongho exited the tunnel, he encountered protesters. Still lost in the memories of the previous night, he only came to his senses after being knocked down. On his way back, Yongho absent-mindedly checked his watch, remembering the girl from last night who wanted to have breakfast with him. But now, this promise seemed like an endless wait. As the train continues to move back in time, it is now the fall of 1984. Yongho has just become a police officer. A girl has fallen in love with him, but Yongho is still hung up on his first love and never looks at the girl. Back at the police station, his colleagues are interrogating a suspect, but Yongho is curled up in a corner, unable to face the darkness. Such is the harsh reality. Those who fight with dragons become dragons themselves. He screamed in agony, accepting the baptism of darkness amidst the chaos. When Yongho came to his senses, the criminal had already lost control, and his hands were covered in filth. He rushed to the bathroom, desperately trying to wash away the stains that tainted his soul. After work, Sunim suddenly approached him. Her eyes were fixed on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her. Sunim spoke with admiration about Yongho's hands, saying they were special, kind, and warm, and had an inexplicable attraction to her. Hearing this, Yongho found it hard to believe. Looking at his hands, stained with filth and blood, he felt unworthy of Sunim and such pure, sacred love. So, when the waiter came over, he reached for the waiter's thigh and asked a question, trying to appear calm.
착하죠.
Yongho's actions deeply hurt Sunim. Tears of sorrow streamed down her cheeks as she handed a camera to Yongho. This gesture signified the end of their love and marked the beginning of Yongho's path of despair. Yet, facing the heartbroken Sunim, Yongho spread his hands and smiled meaningfully, as if questioning whether these tainted hands could still take photos. As Sunim departed on the train, Yongho returned the camera to her. They seemed like ill-fated lovers torn apart by destiny, missing each other between reality and dreams. That night, colleagues held a wild party inside, while Yongho circled outside on his bike. He was lost at the crossroads of life, surrounded by darkness with no light in sight. In the dark, Yong-ho put on a mask and stormed into the noisy room, like a wounded clown performing a solo dance with society. That night, he picked up a stick and swung it wildly. Colleagues dodged, and the waitstaff screamed in fear. For a moment, they couldn't tell if Yong-ho was just drunk or genuinely violent. Later, Yong-ho had a relationship with the waitress. The girl taught him to pray in the dark, asking God to forgive their sins. They eventually got married and had a lovely daughter. Amidst the prayers in the darkness, the train continued to move backward. The time was May 1980. At this moment, Yong-ho and Sunim were deeply in love. She came to visit her boyfriend in the army, but unfortunately encountered an emergency martial law operation. Sunim had to leave disappointed. During the mission, Yong-ho accidentally spilled some mint candies and was beaten by his superior. In that brief moment, the mint candies scattered on the ground were all crushed by the soldiers, mirroring his shattered heart. That night marked a chilling moment in Korean history. The local people initiated the Gwangju Uprising, and a large number of soldiers, including Yong-ho, were sent to suppress the civilians. They killed anyone they encountered, like cold machines in the night. During the suppression, Yong-ho's foot suddenly felt heavy. He carefully took off his shoe, only to find it filled with blood. His comrade quickly sought help, telling Yong-ho to wait in place. In the dark night, he suddenly saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Sun Nyan. But when he came to his senses, he realized it was just a passing schoolgirl. Yong-ho shouted for her to leave quickly, but his finger involuntarily pulled the trigger. Yong-ho was stunned. He climbed up and held the girl's lifeless body, crying out in agony, repeatedly asking himself who made him fire that shot. He bore the mission of his country, yet he had taken an innocent life. As the last glimmer of light in the darkness vanished, his soul forever sank into despair. The train reverses again, late autumn of 1979. At this time, Yong-ho was still a naive and inexperienced young artist. It was also during this time that Shunrin fell in love with him. They went on a field trip together. Whenever Yong-ho saw a cluster of flowers swaying in the wind, he always wanted to capture it with a photograph. The nameless wildflowers and the innocent lover, everything was as beautiful as a first love. Shunrin handed him a mint candy. Its cool scent was like their love, refreshing and pure. He would pick a wildflower for her, watching her blush and run away. She loved his gentle hands and his captivating singing voice. The air was often filled with shy tenderness, allowing them to feel each other's presence amidst applause and cheers. During their chats, Yong-ho felt increasingly familiar with the place. The Iron Bridge and the river always seemed like he had seen them somewhere before. Shunrin softly replied, "Maybe in a distant dream?" Yong-ho was puzzled. If this was a dream, why did it feel so real? Later, they sat together, cheering and singing, but Yong-ho suddenly stood up and left. He sat down in front of a wildflower, looking at the dazzling sunlight, as if longing for the future and reminiscing every unforgettable moment with Shunrin. Unknowingly, Yong-ho shed tears again as he looked up at the sky. The sky was still so blue, and the peppermint candy was still there. But Yong-ho stood in front of the tracks, ending his life in despair. Life is beautiful, isn't it? Yong-ho kept questioning himself and the turbulent times. The pain, despair, and cries he endured were like wildflowers in his life, light as a feather, yet heavy as a mountain. He wasn't unable to bear such weight. He just needed the most beautiful flower to light up his tragic life. But every time he rekindled hope, he saw a deeper despair behind it. Yet, pain is what adds bricks to the building of life. In this way, happiness gains its meaning. If a person's life were only filled with happiness, wouldn't that be even more tragic?